you might say, okay, we've got this model. Maybe I should explain neoliberalism a bit further, because what it says it is not quite what it is. Neoliberalism basically is an overarching philosophy. It's not just about economics and not just about politics, but it's really a description of human beings and a description of what we ought to be. And what it says is that human relations should be conceived as market transactions, that we should see ourselves as buyers and sellers. Our relationships to each other should be defined in that way. And that idea of the market, the commercial sphere, should penetrate every aspect of our lives, because that is the way by which the natural hierarchy of winners and losers can be discerned. You can tell who the natural winners are because they're rich. You can tell who the natural losers are because they're poor. They deserve to be poor. They are the parasites, the freeloaders, the deviants who aren't working hard enough, the shirkers, the scroungers. That's what the story tells us. This is what Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises and others, the founders of neoliberalism, that's the story which they've put out there again and again. And in order to allow that natural hierarchy to emerge, a natural hierarchy which allows the rich total freedom, because they need that freedom to get to the top where they ought to be, they have to be freed from any constraint which the state might impose, from taxation, from regulation, from trade unions. In fact, the political sphere itself, the civic sphere, should be shrunk to almost nothing, because the only legitimate space for decision-making is the market. It has to be done through commercial transactional means, and by those means we discover the winners and the losers. Problem is, of course, that in the great consumer democracy or the great shareholder democracy, some people have more votes than others. Well, that's not a problem. Actually, that's a good thing, because it turns out that inequality, both of wealth and participation, is a good thing. This is what it tells us. This is what Hayek in particular tells us, that an unequal society is better than an equal society, because it generates tremendous wealth at the top, which then trickles down to enrich everyone, as we know so well. And this idea that everything should be run on market relations and businesses and very rich people should be basically freed from the constraints of democracy is what has led to just about every crisis that we face today, the environmental crisis. In fact, Hayek in the Constitution of Liberty actually advocates mining the soil. He says, you know, it makes perfect economic sense to extract all the wealth you can from the soil today and reinvest that into factories or houses or whatever it might be, because the whole idea is to multiply wealth and then society becomes richer. Failed to explain what happens when all the soil runs out. The UN FAO now tells us we have 60 years of harvests left at current rates of soil loss. It led to the financial crisis, because they deregulated the financial sector, and of course it ran riot, designing exotic new financial instruments, securitization, subprime mortgage crisis. All that was basically caused by the deregulation. Eventually, even Alan Greenspan, the great disciple of neoliberalism, was forced to admit, in his words, there was a flaw. It's caused the political crisis, because when you say to people, the state is no longer going to solve your problems, the state is no longer going to change social outcomes, you say to people, politics is pointless. There's no point. All you hear is the yabber of a remote elite talking about their issues, not our issues anymore, because they're not going to change our issues. They're not going to change our lives. Politics is not allowed to change our lives. The state, we're constantly told by people ranging from Ronald Reagan to Liam Fox, is our enemy. It needs to be shrunk, it needs to be broken. The self-hating state tears its teeth into every one of its own organs. And so there's nowhere to go there in politics, and so what attracts people then is an anti-politics, demagoguery, people standing up and saying, oh, to hell with all that debate, all that nonsense, that yabber of talking about issues, that's not going to get us anywhere. I'll give you some slogans. I'll give you some marching music. I'll give you some symbols. And that is why we see all over the world something which would have been inconceivable a decade or two ago, the resurgence of fascism. This is a political consequence of the neoliberal hegemony which has swept the world. But it's worse still than that, because we have internalized and reproduced this doctrine to the extent that we've come to see the world as this hegemonic doctrine sees it. And just as the rich congratulate themselves on their wealth, forgetting the fact that they might have inherited it, that they have their education, their contacts, their confidence, all the rest of it that other people don't have, the poor blame themselves for their poverty. If your credit card is maxed out, never mind that the costs of housing are impossible, you're a feckless, irresponsible person. If you haven't got a job, never mind the fact that there's structural unemployment, you're unenterprising and slovenly. If your kid's unfit, never mind the fact that they've sold off the school playing field, you're a bad parent. And we start to internalize this. And so all the different forms of alienation which this system has created coalesce into psychic rupture. And we see epidemics of mental health distress of all kinds, afflicting people, anxiety disorders, social phobia disorders, eating disorders, self-harm, so many things just hammering us, because we are told that, well, we've got to fight like stray dogs over a dustbin, and that does terrible things to our minds. And yet, despite that huge range of failures, here we are stuck with neoliberalism, because after the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes, he sat down, he was already working on it, and he sat down, he wrote his general theory and said, here's a new story. When Keynesianism fell apart in the late 70s, the neoliberals had been working on their story for the past 40 years. They had it all mapped out, they knew exactly what to say, they'd worked it out again and again, and they came out and said, here's your story, and everyone, thank goodness there's an alternative. When neoliberalism fell apart in 2008, its opponents came up and said, oh, actually we don't have anything. No one had bothered even to look at why certain politics become successful and certain politics doesn't. No one had even bothered to notice that you need a story, and it has to be a new one.